So we come down to my we get to where we actually get to the philosophy of Socrates, the idea of forms. And if you watched all the videos about his death and his life and the daimonia and other things, I think it kind of all pulls together, and you see how all those things can be seen in his philosophy. But the basic idea here for Socrates is that he believed that there was a world of forms that existed out in the reality, that there was a world of ideas, and these ideas were what he called the forms, and they were basically, there are 6 characteristics, and they're listed. They're objective, they're transcendent, they're eternal, they're intelligible, archetypal, and perfect. And the idea is that objective means that they're as real as any object, anything physical. That these aren't just subjective things, that these are objective. That the ideas that exist, like what is a chair, or what is justice, what is reality, are not just ideas that each person comes, but these are as real as, this cup right here. That, they are physical. They are not physical, but they are as real as that. They're transcendent, meaning they're beyond time, beyond space. They're eternal, they're beyond time. They don't change over time. They're intelligible, meaning you understand them through your mind, not through the physical world, not through study of the world, but rather just by the use of your mind. They're archetypal, that means they're archetypes, they're models for everything. And they're perfect, they're not with flaws, unlike everything you see in this world that's flawed. And the idea here is that, if you take, for example, like, the class example is like chairness. The idea is that, Socrates would say, well, how do you know what a chair is? And Socrates would say, because before you were born, your soul lived in a world of ideas, and there was the idea of a chair. And when you see a chair in the physical world, you know it's a chair because it resembles what the idea of chairness is. It's imperfect, as every instantiation in the physical world is imperfect. But you know it is a chair because it resembles the idea of a chair. Now, that is always a weird suggestion, but the idea here is one of the classic examples is, I always like to think about like more of ideas, like what is love or what is justice? And the idea here is like, if you go with justice, like the British system of justice is very different from the American system. But yet they're both attempting to provide justice, that people get punished for breaking the law, people get, that people, are given what they deserve, that they don't take from one another, that civil society is allowed to function. And even though they give different punishments, they give different ways of, the courts assessing guilt and crime, that they're both attempting to provide justice, they just do it in different ways. Well, what Socrates would say, there's an idea of justice, and that each of these you can see is just because it resembles our idea, the idea we have in our head of what justice or right is. Love is another example. That, you see 2 people in love, and you see like a young couple, and they're holding hands, and they're hugging, and doing, they're very physical about it. And maybe, and you see that as an instance of love. But maybe you see an older couple who, are sitting there next to each other when one's sick, that they're crying, they're doing all this stuff. And you see love in that as well. And so they're both examples of love, both instantiations, but they both resemble the idea of love. And so we see the idea of love within their actions. And so each of those is not a perfect concept of love, but they're both examples of it. And so we are able to recognize love. We're able to recognize chairness by seeing it. The example that becomes common is what's called the allegory of the cave. And the allegory of the cave is the idea that a group of people are imprisoned in a cave, and they're imprisoned from a very young age. And so they actually are so young that they forget that physical reality exists. And they're chained to a cage, and their hands are chained back. They can see not their head, they can see not their body. All they see is what's in front of them. And what's in front of them is a wall, and a wall in which shadows are cast. And the shadows are cast from objects, whether it be from the entrance of the cave, when the captors walk by, it casts a shadow onto the wall. Or perhaps it's, the fire that burns that casts a shadow onto the wall. And so all of these are creating shadows. And what happens is Socrates says that eventually, because these people have never seen anything other than the shadows or can remember nothing prior to the shadows, they begin to believe that the shadows are what is real. When their captors come into the room and they hear and see the shadow move, or they hear the voice but they see the shadow move and they see the shadow go here and there, they begin to accept the shadow is their captor. What he suggests is that they are being fooled into believing that the shadows are real, but what's real is outside the cave, the physical reality. And so he comes to the conclusion that that we are being fooled into believing that that those shadows are what is real, but they are not. I think what I want to say. Okay, so but what happens here is that for Socrates, physical reality is sort of like the shadows on the wall, and so that's where it's kind of an odd because, but the idea is that we are somehow stuck in this world, and we see the physical world around us, we see what's around us, we see these changes, we see chairs and cars and everything, and we think that this is real, but it's actually just a shadow of a perfect idea. And somewhere before we were born, we lived in a world of ideas. And we were souls. We were just disembodied souls. We floated around and we experienced ideas. We experienced reality in that way. And then we somehow got stuck into this physical reality. And somehow in the process of getting stuck here in our physical reality, we have come to believe that it is real, but in fact what's real is beyond this. Now this relates back to the daimonion, and it relates back to the other things, because for him, the idea is he's leaving his body and going to this world of ideas. And that the way we learn, the way we know, the way we do things is we think back to these objective, transcendent, eternal, intelligible, archetypal, perfect ideas. And that we see those in the world and we're able to know things, but it's actually the physical, the non-physical, the world of ideas that's what's real. And so even when he does these things, he's in fact going back to that world of ideas that he knew before he was born. What he does say is he says that if one of the prisoners was to get out of the cave and they were to escape and they were to go out and they were to see the world, he said at first they would be overwhelmed and they wouldn't know what was real. And they would eventually, their eyes would adjust and they'd realize that when they heard voices, when they saw trees and we saw the shadows, that those weren't what's real, but rather there were these trees out here, that there were these people out here, that there was a three-dimensional world that was beyond the shadows. And so what would happen is they would go back into the cave to share with their fellow prisoners and say, you must escape, because reality is not in this cave, it is outside, it's real, it's three-dimensional. And what he would say is, he said, what would happen? The other prisoners would laugh and say, you're crazy, no, you're a shadow on the wall, we can see you on the wall, your shadow. And even though he tried, they wouldn't believe him. And he says the same thing occurs with him. Is he's come back, he's had these experiences, he's seen the other world, and he's come back and tried to share that, but instead of believing it, they have basically laughed at him and told him it's not real. And so he says the way we know everything, the way we should know, is to try to access it through our mind, but even that, people won't believe.